Okay, Screencast 3, I've entitled this one simply Monopolies Are Evil. So in the last unit, we looked at perfect competition, and one of the themes there was that it was an ideal market model for various reasons. And here we're going to see exactly why it is that monopolies are on the other side of the continuum that we've been looking at and see all the bad things that they do. So there's a few reasons why I'm saying monopolies are evil. The first reason is that compared to perfect competition, the price that they charge is way too high and the quantity that they produce is way too low. And the easiest way to see this is to simply look at the graphs and remember what perfect competition and monopolies look like. So again, here's what a typical monopoly looks like, and at this point after the last screencast, all these curves should feel or look familiar to you. Now, if this was a perfectly competitive industry, it would simply just be about supply and demand. And remember, that marginal cost curve we can kind of equate to the supply curve. So I'm essentially looking at the same graph, and I'll go back and forth here a couple times so you can see that. Here's the monopoly, same demand curve, using the same marginal cost curve, but using it as the supply curve for perfect competition. Again, monopoly, perfect competition. All right, so if this is perfect competition, we would simply go to where supply meets demand in the industry, and that would determine the price and the quantity. I'll call that P star PC for the perfect competition price, and Q star PC for the perfect competition quantity. Now, with monopolies, remember they do something different. They try to profit maximize by going to where MR is equal to MC and then up to the demand curve to pick their price. So if this was a monopoly, the quantity would be right there. And then again, going up to the demand curve, the price would be right there. So I'll call that Q star M for the monopoly quantity and P star M for the monopoly price. So obviously you can see what's going on here. The quantity goes down and the price goes up. Now that's bad for consumers, right? Because what consumers are essentially experiencing is the fact that they have to pay more for the product, and also they get less of the product. So we're essentially paying more and getting less. And if you think about who the typical monopolist is and who the typical consumer is, this is doubly evil. Because the typical owner of a monopoly, you have to figure, is relatively wealthy. The typical consumer, you have to figure, compared to the monopolist, is relatively less wealthy. So essentially what's going on is a wealth transfer from relatively less wealthy people, consumers, to relatively more wealthy people, monopolists. They're paying them a higher price. So this is kind of like a reverse Robin Hood situation, where we're essentially taking from the relatively poor, consumers, and giving to the relatively rich, monopolists. That I consider evil. Okay, the second reason we don't like monopolies is that they're not productively efficient. You'll remember that in order to be productively efficient, the firm has to be producing the quantity that corresponds to the very bottom of the average total cost curve. And what we saw in perfect competition, at least in the long run, is that they were forced to do that because firms would enter and leave the industry. Monopolists aren't forced to do that. There's no firms entering or leaving this industry, and there's no one forcing them to be efficient. That's bad for society because that's a waste of our scarce resources. If they're not producing things at the very smallest average total cost, what that means is that they're using extra resources that they don't have to be using in order to produce their product. And from society's perspective, in a world of scarcity, that's a kind of evil, I think, right? They're wasting our resources. So again, this is the quantity that monopolies will choose to produce, the quantity where MR is equal to MC. The productively efficient quantity would occur right there, at the very bottom of the average total cost curve. So you can see that they're not producing enough, a high enough quantity, in order to be productively efficient. They're wasting our resources. The third reason we don't like monopolies is that not only are they not productively efficient, they're also not allocatively efficient. Remember that in order to be allocatively efficient, the firm has to be producing the quantity where the price, which represents what it's worth to people, is equal to the marginal cost, which represents what it costs to produce. This is kind of like another marginal benefit equals marginal cost situation. Now you might remember that perfect competitors were allocatively efficient. Monopolists, on the other hand, aren't. So again, going to the graphs, that's the quantity that the monopolist will choose to produce, but that would be the allocatively efficient quantity, where the demand curve, which represents price, is exactly equal to marginal cost, right there at that intersection. If they produced that quantity, they'd be producing every unit where the price, what it's worth to people, represented by the demand curve, is greater than or equal to the marginal cost, which is what it costs society and the firm to produce this good. So that's where we want them to be from an allocatively efficient standpoint. But again, they're not producing enough. They're going to produce this quantity down here. Allocative efficiency would mean producing this quantity. All right, finally, reason number 4 why we don't like monopolies. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss. Now, compared to perfect competition, what we're going to see in the graph is that monopolies shrink consumer surplus, they grow their own producer surplus, and they're going to result, or the industry is going to result, or the market's going to result in some amount of deadweight loss. That was done terribly, I apologize. All right, so again, let's say that we're looking at a perfectly competitive market where supply was simply meeting demand. That would determine the price, and that would determine the quantity. Remember that to find consumer surplus, we're looking for the area below the demand curve, above P star, from a quantity of 0 all the way to a quantity of Q star. So in perfect competition, that represented consumer surplus. Producer surplus is always the area above the supply curve, below P star, from a quantity of 0 up to a quantity of Q star. So in perfect competition, that represented producer surplus, relatively large triangles of happiness. On the other hand, monopolies don't do exactly the same thing, right? They go to where MR is equal to MC, that determines their quantity. They go up to the demand curve, and that determines their price. So what we're going to get is a smaller area of consumer surplus. Again, the area below the demand curve, above the price, from 0 to Q star. In terms of producer surplus, it's going to look a little bit weird. That's what producer surplus looks like for a monopoly. And again, if you follow the rules for finding the area, that'll make sense. Producer surplus is always the area above the supply curve, which again is kind of the same thing as the marginal cost curve. Below the price, from a quantity of 0 up to a quantity of Q star, and now Q star is stopping right there. That's where the monopolist chooses to produce. So I'm going to go back and forth here a little bit and just show you the difference between the monopoly and the perfect competitor. Here's what perfect competition looked like, and here's what things look like to a monopolist. Back, forth, perfect competition, monopolies. If you look at this close enough, you'll notice that something's missing. Can you guess what's missing? That's what's missing. That little triangle that gets lost when monopolies do what they do is what we call deadweight loss. And notice we have some here, and that's bad, right? That's a loss of consumer surplus, a loss of producer surplus. That's a loss of happiness that could exist but doesn't because the monopoly is doing its thing and trying to profit maximize. So if you think about it this way, I really consider monopolies to be kind of like happiness vampires. Essentially, they're going up to consumers, and to use a blood metaphor, they're sucking some of the blood out of the consumers, giving it to themselves, right, enlarging their area of producer surplus. And in the process, they're dripping a little blood onto the floor in the form of wasted surplus. They're willing to kill some happiness in order to give more happiness to them and less happiness to us. And that, to me, seems like evil. All right, that's actually it for this screencast. Next screencast, we'll talk about what the government can actually do about this.
My daughter is really something else, man. She runs the house. She runs the whole house. She decides everything. Like, we were playing hide and seek the other day. We play hide and seek, and we play by her rules that she invented. And do you know why? Because she sucks at hide and seek. When it's my turn to hide, she tells me where to hide. She tells me where. And then when she hides, this is her hiding. She goes over to a wall and does this. She goes, that's it. There's nothing here.